Hello, greetings, and welcome everyone to this video. I am the Ninjaneer, and today I'm going to talk about an issue that I think may be among the most important to address for Legacy Automotive to turn a profit on EVs and ride the wave of change to the energy status quo that they represent. Yay for intros. This issue may also be the reason why many automakers are in danger of going out of business, and why FUD is at an all-time high due to the direct fear that these companies may not exist in a decade. Basically due to their reluctance or inability to adapt, or why the US government seems to be slowing down their regulatory push to get EVs adopted faster. Before I share this issue, I'm going to use an analogy that I will Before I share this issue, I'm going to use an analogy that will thread the needle and accentuate my point, if you would be so kind as to bear with me. When I was a training engineer, or when I was training to be an engineer, I was presented with all sorts of tricks and tips of the trade, tools if you will, that if well used should be able to lead me eventually to a solution, so long as I remained flexible and open to new ideas. My metaphorical and sometimes literal toolkit was stuffed full of math equations, concepts, terminology, history, acronyms, formulas, and a host of other things, all meant to give me the ability to approach any problem with the confidence of someone who, if given enough time, would have the answer. Since I never actually finished my degree, my engineering experience outside of school was scarce, but if I'm to believe my fellow engineering students that graduated and passed their engineering exam directly after school, the process of being an engineer was inverted to kind of hone the number of tools you actually use to your particular field and get really proficient at the tools needed for the particular flavor of engineering that you went into. Those tools that are not used over time become old and rusty in the minds of seasoned engineers. Mostly because they don't use them as often, if at all, and in a very real sense, the cognitive bias that every engineer should fear can rear its ugly head at this point. I am speaking of Maslow's hammer. The quote most often attributed to this bias, whether people realize this bias or not, is, "If the only tool you have is a hammer, it is tempting to treat everything as if it were a nail." How did I make this association? I mean, besides some blogs and videos coming to a similar conclusion. I noticed a cycle that forces a company in the auto industry, or really any industry, to fall into a rut when a new thing comes along and they have trouble adapting. After studying and thinking about that rut, a cycle emerged. What I have come to believe is that Legacy Automotive and startups alike have made their share of mistakes when it comes to the EV transition, and these mistakes can be boiled down to the following cycle. I assert that not only is this bias the reason why Legacy Automotive is struggling, the laundry list of EV companies that have failed up to this point failed in large part because they fell prey to this bias in some aspect of their business model, vehicle design, financial planning, and/or culture. The cycle that I have observed goes something like this. Generally speaking, this is the part of the business that everyone kind of seems to get right. Building hype for and producing a good bit of buzz about your product is something that feels like it may come as second nature to an automotive company, probably because they, like most other industries, have a century or more of lessons from their respective industries, and hundreds more if they used other industries' lessons as well. There are exceptions that I will leave to your interpretation, but in general, marketing tends to be most companies' strong suit. Tell me how many times you've seen this. A dark room filled with some form of fog, followed by some announcer voice or CEO talking up the vehicle, followed by some reel played on a big screen in the back showing how cool the vehicle is, followed by a spotlight or set of spotlights falling on the silhouette of a perfectly detailed vehicle placed at an angle that catches literally all of the best proportions for the reporters and journalists to take pictures of. Yeah, just an example, but it sounds pretty much like everything, right? The mistake that I believe is made here is that the flashy glitz and glamour overshadow the story of the company, and makes the intrigue for the vehicle hollow and short-lived. It is all about how you market for the long term that makes or breaks a company, and nothing works better than a story that sticks with a person long after the fog and bright lights, the hammer in this case, have cleared. Partially because of this first step being so successful, big money is ready to throw big dollars at this new shiny perfectly marketed vehicle, and throw big dollars they do. The influx of hundreds of millions and sometimes billions of dollars allows the company to be infused with its lifeblood, capital. The common mistake here is that big numbers sometimes betray the company and makes them think that they are more or less invincible, or that the money will always be flowing in. Studies done on the ICE automotive industry taken at face value warp the image of what the company leaders believe an EV should be, and what is required to produce them. Even the most successful electric vehicle companies so far made several mistakes, in part, I believe, because they had an ineffective perception of what a car's manufacturing should be. At any rate, companies tend to go really big and expensive on factories and tooling to take their best swing at. Hundreds of millions and even billions of the startup capital that was entrusted to the company is placed, as perhaps it should be, into R&D, marketing to consumers, though this step has been happening all along, hiring staff, and all of the other things a business needs to produce a product. Companies also, for the sake of speed, end up wasting some capital. Perhaps inherently there are those in the company who understand that the vehicle may not maintain its height, but that's honestly pure speculation on my part. The mistake I see in steps 3 and 4 is that they are focused too much on looking like they are doing something, or they end up wasting capital by hiring too many staff and making tons of avoidable mistakes due to trying to move too quickly or adapt technology not made for the purpose the company wants to use it for. Let me be clear that moving quickly is not always a bad thing. But it does, in my observation, make mistakes, and therefore extra capital expenditure easy to overlook. This may not technically be the company's fault every time, but for some reason or another, the demand is not as strong or as robust as expected. Common factors for this that I have observed are the EV not being particularly remarkable or unique, the form or function of the EV not meeting expectations, a long list of issues with no fixed timeline or ineffective tools to address them, or any combination of those factors. All of these factors tend to grow and go unchecked because of the rush to get to market. Right around the time the CFO comes in, I assume waving papers angrily and yelling something similar to what my mom would say when I was younger and asked to go to McDonald's, the other officers of the company probably have a meeting that brings them to the conclusion that scaling back on production goals and turning off some of the machines in the production facility is probably a good idea. I'm being a bit facetious here, but public perception is something similar to this scenario. Having to scale back means either you did not do your due diligence in one area or another early on in the company, or that factors beyond the control of the company were more than what the company could prepare for. It is the inevitable death knell of a company's ambition for an industry. This one is super simple. You can turn off machines, fire some folks, scale back production expectations and reports, but you can't not pay the landlord or taxes without a really good reason. That large factory space not being used still costs money. The less space in a big factory floor space you use, the more expensive the factory becomes and the further out of reach profitability is. I can imagine that when those investing in a company see a huge drop in production, a huge drop in demand, and the same slash more need for funds, especially if their goal was to turn a profit, they are much less prone to put money into something. Long story short, the math has to make sense. It makes a lot of sense early on to realize that just as easily as the money pours in, poor habits can turn the money faucet off as well. The last-ditch effort for most companies that fall into this cycle is to change their business model or to file for bankruptcy, or sometimes both in very rapid succession. If said company does not have such a thing, or if they try and fail to capitalize on said thing, they have to sell their IP or go bankrupt, or both. So, how do you break this cycle? How is the cycle related to my hammer and screw analogy at the beginning? Well, I would like to start by answering the last question first. What Legacy Automotive and even some startups have done is to rip the drivetrain of an ICE vehicle out of it and put in batteries and electric motors and whatever other MacGubbins you need to make a successful electric vehicle. Examples of this are literally every Legacy Automotive company and startups like Sono Motors. Other startup companies source ICE vehicle components and hodgepodge them together into a vehicle like Lordstown. Still, some others decide that their strategy is to take all the tools that worked for ICE vehicles, like robots and the like, and bend them to the needs of the company, something like what Tesla has done successfully, but some others have not. The problem with all three of these strategies is that they all assume the technology will translate well and be a simple process that is more or less plug and play. If history is any indicator, these thought processes without a phenomenally talented individual at the helm are almost without exception doomed from the start. Taking tools from an old technology and adapting them to a new one can be a good idea in some cases, but in my studies it is never as cost-effective or cost-efficient in the long term. As an example, Tesla's first vehicle, aka the original Roadster, sold 7,500 units and functioned more as a proof of concept than a business model. They shifted away from that original Roadster immediately and went to something they more or less designed themselves because they knew a hammer, the original Roadster, was inelegant for screwdriving. Legacy Automotive has made some strides, announcing that they will develop their own platforms, screwdrivers in my analogy, but that came after making an original Roadster-style vehicle, a la rip out the guts of an ICE car and put a battery and motors in it, their business model in the beginning, failing outright, losing a ton of money, and scaling back to do what they should have done in the beginning, start from the ground up. Honda is a great example of this in that they have dedicated themselves to a ground-up EV platform that is vertically integrated after their rocky beginnings in EVs. For the first question, I believe the solution to this problem is easy to say but extremely hard and risky to do, so much so that the majority of the automotive industry today is avoiding it like the plague. There is no guarantee that taking this approach will allow engineers, marketing, design chiefs, finance officers, and everyone else to come up with an answer that customers will be satisfied with, but it would give them a lot better chance, in my humble opinion, to get closer to an answer that will do so more consistently. Instead of leaning into a business model that creates heavy, lackluster, expensive vehicles that lose money at prices nearly double their MSRP, I believe their approach to this problem should start with a literal from-the-ground-up assessment of what an electric car should and needs to be. That study should inform how to design the packaging of the drivetrain, shape, form, and function of the vehicle, and other user experience features to enhance how the vehicle is received, software, tactile surfaces, and all that kind of stuff. All of these things should also be filtered through the lens of how people are going to perceive the value they are getting for the vehicle, or in other words, it also needs to have a good price. To be clear on my thoughts to this point, I don't even believe Tesla has fully designed a vehicle to be an EV up to this point. I can hear the comments now, man, it's about to get real. Please note that this is an outsider looking in, but from what I can tell, they took all of the components of what a car was, stripped down those components for weight and manufacturing efficiency until they agreed some parts had to go back in to keep the vehicle safe. The strategy I just described is a variation to what I described Lordstown to have done. The distinction being that Tesla had very specific and exact needs and had to re-engineer many of those parts and ended up vertically integrating as a result. As I understand the automotive landscape at this time, in large part, most of people that decide to get cars that are not Teslas are either settling or are angry at the leadership at Tesla for some reason or another. Outside of Kia Hyundai, who are really finding their stride when it comes to being a unique alternative to Tesla in all of the ways that I mentioned before. Imagine a world where by every measurable metric, a Chevy, a Ford, a Lucid, or any other EV goes pound for pound with a Tesla, instead of promising they will or outright lying that they are currently. Competition would really heat up, and as a bonus, that competition would thrust the EV market into an undeniable superiority to literally every other option. Adopting this methodology would redefine what someone can get out of their vehicle in ways that will make life better for anyone who interacts with EVs. This simple change, that is difficult to execute, would be the single biggest change in the automotive industry since the assembly line and all but guarantee the futures of vehicle companies that did so. A company that is navigating this new world of EVs very well is Aptera. They don't really fall into this cycle per se. They lead with their story and the merit of their product, which is fantastic for folks like myself that really love a good yarn spun by earnest and hardworking people trying to change the world. Sticking to the basics of having a story that resonates and a mission that elevates is key. Bars. Recently, Legacy Automotive has decided to announce a shift to a hybrid structure as an interim step. Even if they convince folks to go for them, this is a mistake that will cost any automaker that manages to lean into the tech a serious degradation in market share, perhaps even to the point of bankruptcy or a restructuring that sees many thousands of people out of work. My justification for this statement is simple. Is it less expensive to retool a company's factory one time or two times? Is it cheaper to engineer one or two vehicles? On the consumer side, is it easier to maintain a car with one drivetrain or two? Is it easier to maintain 1,000 components or 1,500 components? Is it smarter to use more or less energy to complete a task? If you answered those questions the same way that I did, you know why hybrids are likely to not pay off the way some automotive companies hope they will, or the way some consumers hope they will. As a conclusion, or I suppose a wrap-up to this video, I have believed and will at this moment continue to believe that the electric drivetrain is the right move forward for vehicles of all types at some point in the near future. The way that many automotive companies, legacy and startup alike, have gone about transitioning was either half-hearted or copying half-hearted strategies that leverage the idea of using a hammer to drive a screw. The least expensive solution is to spend a few billion now to completely rethink how these companies have approached EVs so far, much like what Honda is doing, and any company that is unwilling to do so is in very real danger of not existing in the future. I appreciate those who made it to the end and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What did I miss? What did I misinterpret? What is your favorite color? I don't know. I would like to know what your thoughts are down below. I am the Ninjineer, and I will catch you next time. How did I make this association? I mean, besides some blogs and videos coming to a similar conclusion, son of a mother. Spit it out! Bleh! Okay. And all but guarantee the features of the vehicle companies, the futures, not the features. Bleh! Okay.